Welcome to the deep dive. We've got a really dense but critical stack of sources today. They connect some pretty big dots between Arctic strategy, high-stakes geopolitics, and, believe it or not, the immediate U.S. fiscal crisis.
Exactly. And for you listening, our mission here is really to give you a shortcut to understanding the U.S. ambition to acquire Greenland.
Because this isn't just talk anymore, is it?
Not at all. As of January 2026, this has shifted. It's gone from a sort of historical curiosity to an explicit U.S. national security priority. So this deep dive, it's all about unpacking the colossal consequences of that.
Strategic fiscal alliance consequences.
All of it. We really need to get to the why. Why does the administration feel this risk is necessary, and at what cost?
Okay, and to get to the cost, we have to start with the event that really accelerated this whole thing, Operation Absolute Resolve.
Right, January 3rd, 2026. The military raid on Caracas.
Which resulted in the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife.
It was a shocking show of force. The sources describe this huge military operation. We're talking airborne assets, ground assets.
And there were casualties.
Yes. 7 U.S. service members were injured. But tragically, over 70 people were killed. And that figure includes 32 Cuban citizens who were reportedly acting as security personnel.
And the administration's immediate reaction was, well, it wasn't to apologize. It was to explicitly link this action in Venezuela to the ambition for Greenland.
And they framed both under this new strategic doctrine. They're calling it hemispheric consolidation.
Hemispheric consolidation. So what does that actually mean?
Well, this is where the policy shift becomes really profound. The doctrine is aimed squarely at eliminating what they call extra-hemispheric influence.
Meaning Russia and China.
Exactly. Not just from South America, but extending that consolidation all the way up through the Arctic. The sources argue this is a fundamental pivot for U.S. foreign policy.
Moving away from a rules-based order.
And toward what they are calling resource realism.
Resource realism. That sounds intentionally vague. What does that philosophy actually look like in practice?
In practice, it's the belief that controlling material assets like strategic locations, choke points, or natural resources is just inherently more important than upholding abstract diplomatic norms.
So the capture of a head of state, which many international legal scholars called a catastrophic breach of sovereignty.
That's the first real-world application of the philosophy.
And for you listening, this is the core link we have to make. Unilaterally seizing Maduro erodes the very idea of sovereignty. So why is that relevant to Denmark?
Because Greenland is sovereign territory of the Kingdom of Denmark. They're a smaller, less powerful NATO ally. So if the U.S. shows it's willing to seize a head of state...
And justify it under this new doctrine.
Right. It begs the question, what stops that same logic from being applied to Copenhagen if they stand in the way of a strategic imperative like Greenland? The sources force us to connect those two events.
Okay, so let's unpack the strategic case for this. Because if the risks are that high, the benefits must be, well, they must be massive. Let's start with the military facts, which is where the argument is supposedly strongest.
The first pillar is geography, specifically the GIUK gap.
Greenland, Iceland, and the UK.
Exactly. Greenland anchors this critical maritime choke point. It's the key monitoring area for the Russian Northern Fleet, especially their ballistic missile submarines trying to get out into the Atlantic.
And it's not just subs, right? The sources talk about undersea infrastructure.
A huge part of it. Over 95% of all intercontinental data traffic travels through undersea cables that pass right through or near the GIUK gap.
So if you lose control of that area,
you risk losing the digital backbone of the Western world. The sources remind us that during World War II, the Greenland air gap was a, quote, killing ground for Allied merchant convoys because of Nazi U-boats. The strategic relevance hasn't changed.
But we do have a presence there already. Pacific Space Base, which everyone used to call Thule Air Base.
We do. About 150 U.S. service members are there under the 1951 Greenland Defense Agreement. And that base is absolutely vital.
That's where the 12th Space Warning Squadron operates, right? The big early warning radar.
That's the one. It detects ballistic missile threats, tracks space debris. It's a core part of North American missile defense. So the argument for annexation is that it will let the U.S. unilaterally deploy advanced interceptors there without any Danish oversight.
But isn't that the whole point? Speed. Unilateral control in a crisis.
That's a fair question, but the analysis really slams the brakes on that idea. The current 1951 agreement, it already grants the U.S. full operational control over the base.
So the gain in speed is marginal.
Incremental at best. And it's certainly not worth the catastrophic cost of, destroying the NATO alliance to get it.
Okay, so if the military benefit is incremental, then the mineral wealth argument must be the real economic driver here. The administration has been pushing this claim that Greenland holds 25% of the world's rare earth reserves.
And this is the crucial moment for you, the listener, to really grab the fact check from these sources. That 25% figure is, well, it's significantly overstated. It borders on misinformation.
Overstated.
Global rare earth reserves are estimated at about 91.9 million metric tons. Greenland's reliable estimate is 1.5 million metric tons.
Wait, 1.5 million against 91.9 million.
That's right. So we're talking about 1.6% of world reserves, not 25%. And what's even crazier is that the United States itself currently holds more rare earth reserves at home, about 1.9 million metric tons.
That seems completely counterintuitive. If the U.S. has more at home, why this fixation?
Because the goal isn't necessarily resource dominance, it's about diversifying the supply chain. But even if the reserves were massive, you immediately hit the processing bottleneck. Experts called Washington's push on this absurd.
It's absurd.
Because China controls about 90% of global refining capacity. There's a great analyst quote here, it really clarifies it. Even if you mined it in Greenland, then you have to send it to China for processing.
So the dependence doesn't actually change.
Not at all. You're just shifting the extraction to a much colder, much more expensive environment.
And there's a huge local political problem too, right? With the most valuable site, Kavana Field.
A massive one. Kavana Field is rich in things like neodymium and dysprosium, but it's totally blocked by Greenland's own laws.
The uranium ban.
Exactly. In 2021, Greenland banned uranium mining above 100 parts per million. The ore at Kavana Field has between 250 and 350 parts per million. So extraction is currently illegal under Greenlandic law. The whole mineral argument is basically deadlocked.
Let's shift then from the limited strategic benefits to the immense financial cost. Any acquisition has to be put into the context of what the sources call the precarious U.S. fiscal landscape.
This is the critical domestic constraint. The U.S. national debt is already over $38.5 trillion. That's a debt-to-GDP ratio of 120%. And when you hit that level, you trigger what economists call fiscal dominance.
What does fiscal dominance mean for the average person?
It means the crushing cost of just servicing the debt starts dictating all your policy decisions. Interest payments now surpass $1 trillion a year.
$1 trillion. More than the entire Department of Defense budget.
More than the entire defense budget. And into this high-debt, high-interest environment, we dropped the estimated cost for Greenland. The estimates range from $500 billion all the way up to $2 trillion.
And that would all have to be borrowed.
At historically high rates. That cost alone represents anywhere from 13 to 53% of last year's debt increase. It's an enormous outlay, and it leads right to the guns versus butter problem.
Tying Arctic expansion directly to the entitlement crisis. The sources mention the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBBA.
Right, and that's a descriptive term the analysts are using for the recent omnibus spending bills that, dramatically increase the debt.
And this spending is what's accelerating the insolvency date for Social Security and Medicare.
That's the projection, pushing insolvency up to 2032.
2032. That is a critical date. What happens then if nothing is done?
The consequences are severe. For Social Security, it's an automatic, across-the-board 24% benefit cut.
24%.
For a typical retired couple, that's an $18,400 reduction a year. And Medicare hospital insurance payments would be cut by 11%. These happen automatically.
And the administration's counter-argument is that mineral revenues from Greenland could fix this, maybe by the 2040s.
It just doesn't work. The timeline is completely mismatched. The crisis hits in 2032. Meaningful mining revenue, even if you could get it, takes 10 to 15 years of development. The math just isn't there.
So, limited benefits, staggering financial cost. Now we have to talk about the practical human cost. Greenland has a tiny population, 57,000 people?
Roughly, yeah. And a GDP of only about $3 billion. And the sources use Puerto Rico as a cautionary tale here.
How so?
Well, Puerto Rico has 3.2 million people. Greenland has less than 2% of that population. Spread across a vastly more hostile environment, you get zero economies of scale for infrastructure.
And the infrastructure needs are they're staggering. There's no road network connecting towns.
Everything is by expensive air or sea transport. And any construction project, the cost is multiplied. The sources say cold weather construction costs are 3 to 5 times mainland U.S. rates. It's a multi-$100 billion project just to maintain a basic quality of life.
Which leads us to a really fascinating hidden cost that the sources flag, the Jones Act dilemma.
Right. If Greenland were annexed, it would immediately fall under the Merchant Marine Act of 1920.
Which requires all cargo between U.S. ports to be on U.S.-flagged, U.S.-built, and U.S. cruise ships.
And Greenland is 100% dependent on maritime imports for everything. Food, fuel, materials, everything.
So what does that do to the price of, I don't know, a gallon of milk?
It makes it crippling. Analysis from Puerto Rico suggests the Jones Act adds about $1.5 billion in costs to their economy every year. Applying that to Greenland's tiny economy would be devastating.
And we haven't even talked about what the Greenlanders themselves want.
They've been very clear. A 2025 poll showed 85% of them oppose becoming part of the U.S.
And their leaders have been blunt.
Absolutely. Greenland's PM, Jens Fredrik Nielsen, demanded, quote, "No more pressure, no more hints, no more fantasies." And the Danish PM, Mette Frederiksen, has told the U.S. to stop the threats.
This is where we have to tie it all back to the beginning, back to the Venezuelan precedent.
And that question from Senator Mark Warner right after the Maduro capture.
He asked, does this mean any large country can indict the ruler of a smaller adjacent country and take that person out?
Because the administration explicitly linked Maduro to Greenland under that hemispheric consolidation banner, it fuels this deep concern that the U.S. is abandoning the principle of sovereign equality.
It sounds like a return to 19th century imperialism.
That's how the sources frame it. Which brings up the final massive question. What does this do to the U.S. alliance structure? The sources suggest this risk alone outweighs any possible benefit.
The core threat is to NATO itself. If you coerce or take military action against Denmark, a founding member,
you shatter the foundational principle. An attack on one is an attack on all. It instantly transforms NATO into what one analysis calls a hegemonic protection racket.
A racket where you're protected from outsiders, but not from the most powerful member.
Precisely. French and German officials are already quoted expressing, profound uneasiness, and Russia has already declared the Arctic a zone of our national interest just to raise the stakes.
But the single highest strategic risk identified in the source material is what it could do to Canada, the Canadian nuclear question.
This is really high stakes. Annexation would create a strategic nightmare for Canada. It would hem them in on three sides.
Greenland to the east, the U.S. south, Alaska to the west.
It would become, quote, an effective bulwark against Canadian maneuverability.
But why would that push Canada toward nuclear weapons?
Because that geographic encirclement, coupled with the erosion of sovereignty norms, it could force Canada to consider a radical defensive shift. The analysis warns this could prompt Ottawa to pursue its own nuclear capability.
Which would shatter decades of non-proliferation policy.
And change the global security landscape overnight. It's a colossal, completely unacceptable risk.
So if annexation is this high-risk imperialism, what's the alternative? We can't just ignore the Arctic.
The sources point to a diplomatic middle ground that already exists. It's called the Compact of Free Association, or COFAFA.
The model we use with nations in the Pacific, like Palau and Micronesia.
It's an ideal hybrid. It grants the U.S. full defense responsibility and exclusive military access. It prevents rivals like China or Russia from setting up a presence, and it provides financial aid while maintaining self-governance for the territory.
So it secures every single U.S. strategic interest.
All of them. The basing rights, priority on minerals excluding China.
But without the massive fiscal burden or the alliance-destroying cost of coercing Denmark.
Exactly. The U.S. could offer partnerships instead of domination. Co-investment in ports and energy, mineral development partnerships with shared revenue, enhancing security at Pacific with their consent.
So to summarize the core assessment from our sources, pursuing Greenland through domination is high-risk imperialism. The costs are completely disproportionate to the benefits.
Especially since, as we said, the U.S. already has military access and larger rare earth reserves at home. The sources list 6 major unacceptable risks: alliance destruction, fiscal crisis acceleration, nuclear proliferation in Canada, international isolation, Arctic instability, and of course, severe domestic polarization.
And to leave you with one final thought, an analyst summarized this whole potential move by calling it the greatest foreign policy blunder since at least the Vietnam War.
And that analogy is deliberately provocative, but it's apt. Vietnam was a peripheral interest pursued militarily based on flawed logic that ultimately undermined American power through fiscal drain and the erosion of unity.
So the source concludes that Greenland isn't an opportunity for expansion,
but a test of whether the United States remains committed to the principles it claims to defend.
So I'll leave you with this question to think about. which path partnership and sovereignty or domination and coercion is actually sustainable for long-term Western security. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.